the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we examined a virus that claimed lives well before COVID-19 and that seems likely to do so well after the pandemic. That's the virus of prejudice and hate. The high-profile killings of Black men and women by both police and self-appointed vigilantes in 2020 have led to widespread recognition of the systemic nature of racism and the need for change. We continue our discussion with four faith leaders in part 2 of Seeking to Breathe Free. So in last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we began to look at this basic issue of racism and how it's impregnated society in the United States and some of the problems that it's creating. I'd like to welcome our guests, Dr. Steve Baber, Reverend Dr. Steve Baber, who is the pastor of St. Peter's United Methodist Church in Bellevue. Gene Cash, retired educator, coach, and also retired from the U.S. Army and a parish leader at Mary Queen of Peace Catholic Church in Sammamish. Reverend Dr. Troy Carr, pastor of Grace United Methodist Church in Seattle. And Reverend Byron Harris, the assistant pastor of New Calvary Baptist Church in Norfolk, Virginia, and also in the PhD program at Seattle University. Thank you again for agreeing to stay with us and participate in yet another conversation on this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's pick up where we were last week, or where we ended off. And of course, this year has brought up the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, to name just a few. What has been your experience helping your congregations deal with these deaths? And as we've heard the stories that each of you have recounted, I think the question that comes up, are these exemplifying unmet promises in what's been called the American experience, or do they reflect some systemic problems that date all the way back to the founding of this country?
This is a very, and thanks for the question, Jeff, but it's a very timely question, and it touches on a lot of things. And I think William Faulkner's quote about, history is never really dead or in the past, but it is with you. Mm-hmm. And we are living in sort of that sort of presence all the time. And so the founding of this nation, I've used the term, it was one of the birth defects of America's democracy. But it was like, where did this come from? If one begins to do research, where did this come from? And I think that Kelly Brown Douglas, she does a great job in her book about tracing, because she was upset about what happened to Trayvon Martin. And I know, we'll probably talk around something similar related to that as we go farther in this. But it's the start of this nation, and what she posits in her book, and I found it profound, was that there was a Roman historian back in 56 AD named Tacitus. And Tacitus wrote about some Germanic tribes that the Roman Empire had ran into. And they had some traits and characteristics that the Romans found interesting. This issue of private property, this issue of how they govern themselves, and that everybody, at least all the males, would have a vote in what decisions the tribe would take. And they really wanted individual liberty and freedom for each member. And how they continually fought, and the Romans had a very hard time conquering these Germanic tribes. And if you begin to trace that, Jefferson talked about Tacitus, that, some of what his teachings and words should still be part of America's way today. Ben Franklin talked about Tucídides. So if you begin to read some of the documents, if you study the Puritans who came to America, you study the Pilgrims, they thought that they were two things. One, the select people of God, and that they were also a direct descendant of the Germanic tribe that Tucídides had talked about. And so that's how that came to America. And it gave birth to Western expansion, America's exceptionalism. All these things are bred and birthed by that. And so we still have to contend today with, I think as Byron says, how one begins to deconstruct that, because all of our institutions in this country, you can call it the invisible hand, but they're all set up to just continue that teaching, both overtly, invertly, consciously, unconsciously. It's in the DNA of the nation. So that becomes a challenge. And a lot of the pushback and what we're having today, because what happens is that private property thing, tracing all the way back to those tribes in ancient Germany. America says, and I think it was Jim Collins, a professor at Columbia, who said racism in America is private property rights, which Americans love and talk about law and order. That is meant for whites. And when people of color, and especially when Black people step into that realm, that's a criminal trespass and breaching, and it must be stopped. So from police on, you know, the police and slave chasers and rollers, you know, they were the forefathers of the police department. So we still have, back to Faulkner saying, all that is still with us today, Jeff. And, you know, the church has played a very implicit role in forwarding and not teaching and saying things about what was inhumanly being done, because when you don't do somebody right, there's a rational dissidence that one has to deal with. Because it doesn't take, a little child can tell you something is wrong. So an adult would know when something is wrong. But a child is able, if you take two children without any formal education, and you say, would you like a pony? And you give one a plastic pony and you give one a live pony, the one with the plastic pony is going to say, that wasn't fair. So you have to have a dissidence when you want to treat somebody as less than human. Otherwise, you know, because you have to make sense of your reality.
It strikes me that there is the secular response, if you will, to these overall issues, but there are the faith communities, and each of you lead in those faith communities. What is your biggest disappointment in terms of the lack of response by other elements of the Christian faith? You sometimes watch things like, there was a leader, I think it was in Texas, that said slavery was a blessing. You get other people's response. What's your biggest disappointment that you've heard as this process of confronting racism wears on?
Well, I'll start real quick. I remember when I was the only Black administrator in the Lake Washington School District in the early 90s. And we had these meetings, and the word diversity started to come up. And I would talk to the people on committees, principals, and I said, no, we need to get rid of the word diversity right now. And we need to just look at it. It's called racism. And we need to understand it's a learning process because you're in denial. It's like the church, in denial. And as long as you're in denial from the hierarchy up, that's why a lot of times things come from the bottom up, then it will exist. So what we would do is look at curriculum, the biases in curriculum, and look at when kids walk in of different colors, can they see themselves in the library? So I purged the library. You're not saying that the white books weren't any good, but I'm saying this is what kids need to look at. And even white kids need to look at kids of color what they're interested in. And so we purged the library. But I think even in the church that I am in now, I think that one of the things is with leadership is so important, because Immaculate Conception had something on racism. I went with Father Chad about actually last week, but it's going on all the time. You just can't have a meeting once a month, invite people in and have people talk. There's nothing wrong with that. But it needs to be like, and then I'll stop. It's like when I had Jeff, about 30, 40 people over at my house every summer, Jewish people, people from the Baptist church, people from the Catholic church, and then some of us would go out to the Muslims, just to hang out, to learn, to learn from them. And I think that our church needs to do more of that, engaging others, not in our way of thinking, but what can they do to alleviate the systemic racism that is still going on.
One of the things that has just been such a disappointment for me is that churches are mostly located in communities. And as these residential communities have changed over the years, the church has been asleep and has not done any intentional work to follow the pattern and to have a theology that makes sense for that community. So therefore, those community connections are severed, or they're not there, or they're not realistic. And we have been so disconnected from our real mission and our real call, cocooning ourselves, isolating ourselves, trying to preserve brick and mortar, measuring our success by numbers and those things that are self-serving instead of us being servants out in our communities. So it's very disappointing that now we're in a stage that we know about. Many of my, let me speak for myself, many of my members understand too well the civil rights movement because they were there, they were a part of it, they were impacted by it, they were redlined and suffered through all of that, but something happened where they went to sleep. And now this real situation has risen its head again, and they're not theologically ready. They're not ready in head nor heart to be able to respond to this reality that never went away. Mm-hmm. It just became polarized for other more popular issues that would arise over time and decades. It never went away. So that need to be connected back with community, with a theology that makes sense for the community that you are in and the times that you are living in, because our voice still does have authority, and it has the authority to be able to call things and change things and dismantle. So that's been, for me, one of the things that has really disappointed me about the faith communities. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess for me, Jeff, it's a good question again, and thanks, is that it's never been part of the church's ecclesiology to teach and talk about racism. Black churches were founded as a rejection of the theology of white Christianity. And when I talk about American Christianity, I'm going to talk about it in a broad brush stroke, because I'm usually talking about white America, because the 60s was what happened as America tried to hold out to the world that it is a freedom-loving, freedom-giving, freedom-established nation. Well, Black folks were saying, wait a minute, hold on, that's not quite right. And so the church, there was this Mediterranean, deep subterranean vein of freedom, and that we have to experience God different from how my enslavers are saying this is God.
Mhm.
And so you look, Niebuhr was considered one of the great American theologians, if not the greatest. They never wanted to deal with racism. It wasn't taught in the seminaries. So racism, the church in a way helped to give immunity and to give cover to racism, because it didn't want, you can address, and I think the gentleman's name is Patton, who went and studied, because he came out of the Southern Baptist Church, and you had a lot of churches that to some degree supported racism. I'm out of the United Methodist Church. Well, the AME Church walked away from the United Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal, essentially because of racism. Richard Allen and them said they didn't want us on our knees. Well, you know what? We'll go out and start our church. I'm glad to be a Methodist, and I was born a Methodist. I'll die a Methodist. But, he had to go do his thing, because somewhere they're seeing in the white polity little bits of differences that were given. And so I guess my frustration is those teachings were never taught in seminary. Just as you got to learn Old Testament, you got to learn New Testament, you got to learn preaching, you got to learn some some administrations and how to do something in a hermeneutical basis. You need to do some social policy study and some historical study that will get you to a theology that affirms all humanity, and that was not done and is not being done. It's getting better.
Mm-hmm.
Evangelicalism and fundamentalism Christianity is very dangerous. And I always talk about the danger of Americanity as what Dr. Baber is talking about. And there's also a danger in religiosity versus relationship. We were given the colonizer's religion, but the relationship that we had with the divine is something that we had before we ever got into the hulls of slave ships and made our way to this continent and to this country. And so with that being said, I am reminded of the Negro spiritual that says, everybody talking about heaven ain't going. And with that particular lyric, everybody is talking a good game, but it's about putting your money where your mouth is and where your actions are that speak to your relationship with the divine. With that being said, I'm reminded of Howard Thurman, the theologian, as he talked about how his mother would not allow him to read from the book of from anything that Paul wrote, because she could not identify with the idea of the concept of slave, obey your master, for this is right. Mm-hmm. And there are those type of stories of Black theologians and Black liberation preachers that continues to sustain the church. And so my disenfranchisement with my Eurocentric brothers and sisters is because, as Dr. Baber has said, they have not spent time on the threshing floor to understand the plight of all of those of us who are calling on the name of the divine. And so when I think about some of my contemporaries and the persons who I idolize or that I find mind-boggling in this theological discussion, such as Otis Moss and Frederick Douglass Haynes and my own pastor, Marcus Small and Jeremiah Wright, and all those different preachers who come through schools such as Howard University School of Divinity, the Samuel Dewitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia and ITC in Atlanta. There are also theology that are teaching this gospel, that are teaching these truths, and we must continue to elevate them, and we must continue to allow them to have that space, and they must claim their space, because we've never been allowed anything. And so those type of institutions must continue to claim their space in the conversation, because if we don't tell our narrative, then it will not get told. So that is my disconnect with that concept.
A couple of quotes come to mind at this point. Dr. Martin Luther King advanced the concept of the beloved community, and Congressman John L. Lewis, who just passed as we're taping this program, used the phrase love in action. What do those mean to you, and how can we use those to get where we need to go from where we're at right now?
Well, from my perspective on how do we get to beloved community and love and action of John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, it's getting to an understanding, as I always ask people, to recognize the humanity of others. Do not put it on a scale. Do not put it on a hierarchy. God did not make and create mistakes. Imago Dei, you're made in the image of God. And that has to hold true, whether you are someone that walks through the halls and corridors of power, or you sleep and live in a back alley without a roof over your head. You still have that dignity of your human worth, of your human humanity, that ontological existence of your being. And so that is how I look at getting at a beloved community. You begin to beloved people. And that's some of what I try to, in my teachings with contextual, is that you have to love people. You may have disagreements with them. You may not turn around and like them, but they still are created in the image of God. It doesn't mean we're going to break bread together. It doesn't mean we're going to sit at the same dinner table, but we're going to sit at the brotherhood and sisterhood table.
I touched on this earlier in our former segment, Jeff, that this capacity to love, this ability to love my neighbor, but also hold my neighbor accountable, to speak truth to my neighbor. That's what the love really is about. It's not a romantic or a Hollywood love I'm talking about. I'm talking about loving you enough to journey with you and be in attention of it with you, but tell you the truth about you.
I think that good trouble would be like in '01 when we had 9/11. And I was a principal in Federal Way. And the Muslim students were being attacked verbally, and a couple of them off campus. So I had to have several meetings. I had to have school assemblies, a couple of them. And the way you two speakers before me spoke so eloquently about that we live in this house, community that we are in, we are to love and respect those of different faiths, especially at that time, the Muslims, because they were being persecuted in our environment and in my school. So what I did was bring the Muslim parents in, and I would bring other white parents in and black parents, because the black parents were up on the side of the white parents at the time. And I said, A, we can't tolerate, we have to love, and we can't tolerate disrespect of others who are different. And I know that there's a lot of things going out there because of what happened at 9/11, but they're praying 4 or 5 times a day. You're praying on Sundays. And I just told them up front, this is the way it's going to be in my house and in our house. And so what I did was get flags of every country and put them up in the cafeteria. Of course, me being an American, that's the flag I'm going to die for. But I put up a flag of every country, and we had about 60 different countries where our kids came from. And we put them up in the cafeteria. And I said that in this school, no flag is going to be dominant or better than the other flags, but we're going to love each other. Like Reverend here said from Bellevue, we are going to respect each other. And I used to tell them, don't have to go to Godfather's Pizza after school with each other, but we're going to try. And it's hard to not see all the black kids sitting in the cafeteria together. And it's not easy. But love has to be the surface of everything. And that's the way Jesus was.
Well, I thank you each very much. It's clear there's so much more that we'd like to go into, but I think our next step is to look at what is the nature of change that's needed, and how can people of different ethnicities, different faiths, etc., partner together to make that change happen. So there is going to be a part 3 to this. We hope you'll tune into that next week on Challenge 2.0.